Hello, welcome to the Endgame course. I would like to help you understanding and enjoying the endgame part. We'll learn necessary concepts and ideas step by step. This series is about pawn endgames. Are you ready to learn? Let's go and let the orange juice work miracles. This time we'll be talking about the opposition, as it is another interesting and important concept in a pawn endgame, and unfortunately it is not always understood or explained solid enough. I guess we can change it, and I believe you can learn about this mystery opposition the right way. Before we get into the explanations, let's briefly look what we are going to learn. The first point is what is the opposition and what types of it we can list. Another one, how to figure out who has the opposition. Next one, how does the opposition work? Another one, what are the benefits of possessing the opposition? Next one, how and why the opposition can help to restrict the opponent's king. And another one, is the opposition attacking or strictly defending weapon? And the last one, what is the relationship between the opposition and key squares? Which one is more important and why? Let's get started. Now we have the first position. At first position you can see the concept of opposition, and the concept of opposition is the following. Opposition is always whenever the kings are standing on the line, either horizontal, either vertical, either diagonal. There will be another factors that needs to be fulfilled in order to be the opposition. For example, one of the factors is that the kings must stay between each other with the distance of 1 squares in between, or more precisely 1 square, 3 squares or 5 squares, at an odd number of squares. And therefore at this picture, as you can see, we can have the kings, and the kings are standing 1 square on the same line between them, and therefore they are in the opposition. At the same time, in a moment we'll tell who has the opposition, because it depends on who had the last move. But before that, let's just have a look what kind of opposition we can see. This one is the direct opposition, and this is on the vertical line. Next one, this one is the opposition, again into the vertical line, but this time this is the opposition that is having more squares in between the kings. Take notice, always it needs to be the odd number of squares, either 1 square, either 3, either 5. And now, another type of opposition is the opposition that is the horizontal one. And again, there may be either 1, 3 or 5 squares between the kings, and the kings must stay on the same line, at this moment on the same rank. Another type of opposition is the horizontal opposition, but this time the long one. And as you can see, between the kings there are 5 squares. Therefore, it is the opposition because of the odd number of squares between the kings. And now, another type of opposition is the direct opposition, but this time on the diagonal. Direct opposition means there is the least number of squares between the kings. At this example, just 1 square. And now, another one is the same type of opposition, but this time not a direct diagonal opposition, but long diagonal opposition. Why? Because there are 3 squares between the kings, and as you can see, the kings are on the same diagonal. And now, another one. Now, let's have a look about the opposition. It is the diagonal one, how we can distinguish very easily, because not always we need to count the numbers between the kings. For example, if the kings are on the diagonal, instead of counting the number of squares, is it the odd number or the even number, we can just distinguish the opposition a little bit easier way. For example, we are drawing the square and seeing if all of the color of the squares are the same. As you can see, white king is standing on the dark square, the same as the black king, and all of the corners are the same color as both of the kings. Therefore, it is the odd number of squares between the kings. At this moment, as you can see, there are 5 squares. Now, if the kings are standing on the diagonal, but if one of the king will be standing a little bit closer, we'll see another case of the diagonal opposition. This would be the diagonal opposition, that is the long one. And now Another one would be if the kings would be standing on this blue square. As you can see, white king would stay on the square d4, black king is staying the same, and all of the squares in the corners are the same color. Therefore, this is the opposition. And the last case would be if the white king would stand on the square f6, and at the same time the black king would be standing in the corner, and again all of the corners are the same colors, and therefore if the kings are standing on the diagonal, it is the opposition. And now, about the opposition we'll be talking in a moment with some of the examples to explain the concept. But what you should know, that the opposition is always whenever the side has already made a move, or at the same time if the one side is not on the move. Therefore, the side who is not on the move possesses the opposition if all of the conditions are met. Either kings are standing on the horizontal or vertical line, either on the diagonal, and there must be the odd number squares between them, either 1, 3 or 5. And now let's get for the next one. Now we are seeing the position that there are just the kings. Take notice that the pawn is not relevant. It is something like just treat it if the pawn is completely not existent. And now at this moment we can see that kings are not in the opposition as yet, because the kings are not standing on the squares of the same color, especially we are talking about the lines, either the horizontal, either vertical. At this moment the kings are standing on the e-file, but take notice that the white king is standing on the dark squares, whereas black king is standing on the light squares. But what happens if the white king advances into the e6 square? Now both kings are standing on the same color of the squares, both kings are standing on the same line, at this moment at the e line, and at the same time, as you can see, there is the odd number of squares between them. And due to white made the move as the last one, we can say that white has or possesses the opposition. And now what the opposition is all about. Let's check it out on the example. What happens if black tries to escape from the last rank? After the opposition, white would be having the power not to allow for that for black's king. If the king gets left and the king tries to escape via the squares c7, b6 and a5, white king says no, I am having the control of the squares on the 7th rank, I'm not going to give you the access to the 7th rank, 6th rank and so on. Now again, black king tries to escape, white king says no, I am having all of the squares covered, you cannot escape this way. Again, and black king is not able to escape because white king has too many squares into the control on the 7th rank. And now after this we can see that black king tries to get the other way, but all of the time after the king moves on the last rank, white king is having the opposition, not allowing the king to escape. And again, black king tries to escape, white king says no, I am having the control of the 7 squares, you cannot escape. And again, the position repeats, and as you can see, all of the time black king is unable to escape from the last rank, and at the same time white king is having full control of the black king locked on the last rank, right? And at this moment, as you can see, black king can only go back and forth over the last rank because white king has too much space control. And at the same time, this is the very important example because it shows that if black king cannot penetrate the position, it cannot make any useful moves. And at the same time, as you can see with the blue line is the cutoff that the king cannot cross. It is something like that king is in the jail or prison. Okay, let's get for the next example. Another position shows the kings on the same starting position, but this time it is black who is on the move. What happens? Previously, as we saw, black king was not able to escape from the last rank. Due to the white king having too much control space, black king was unable to escape. What happens if the roles are reversed? After the king gets into the e7 square, as we can see, the kings are standing on the same rank file or diagonal with the odd number of squares. And now how does it benefit black? As you can see, Now it is black who is having the opposition, because black make the move as the last one, and therefore they possess the opposition. And now white needs to make a move with the king. Take notice the pawn is just for the sake of simplicity, because otherwise I couldn't show you the opposition this way. Therefore treat it as the pawn is not existent. Now if white gets the right side, because white needs to make a move with the king, black is penetrating the position on the left side. At this moment with the d6, white tries to stop the king from infiltrating, for penetrating, but black says no, we are going forward, you cannot do anything. At this moment, as you can see, black king has already reached the third rank, and therefore one of the ideas about the opposition is to be able to get through the position, or penetrate the position, or infiltrate the position. And that's why at this moment, if white king gets on the right side of the board, onto the king side, black king gets into the left side, onto the queen side. Therefore black king can get into any squares on the third rank due to the opposition. And what happens if white king would get the other way? If white king gets into the d5 square, this time white king gets into the queen side, therefore black king is going to escape via the king side. And as you can see, black king is going pretty nicely. And at this moment again, black king has the opposition. And now white needs to make the move with the king, and after moving with the king, black king reached the third rank, the same as previous we just mentioned. And that's why at this moment we can see that the opposition helps the kings to break through, to penetrate, or to get further into the opponent's camp. Therefore it is one of the ideas about the opposition. Let's get for the next one. At this moment, as we can see, both kings are standing on the same line. However, it's not the opposition as yet, because white king is standing right now onto the dark squares, whereas black onto the light squares. Therefore the kings must stay on the same color of the squares if we want to talk about the opposition. And now at this moment white starts. White plays king to e4. And now as you can see, both kings at this moment are standing on the same color of the squares. Between the kings there are the odd number of squares, in this case the 3 squares. And now let's see what happens if the black king will be going back and forth at the last rank. Now if the black king gets into the last rank onto the d8, white can get into the square d4, and at the same time reaching opposition again. And now after the king gets onto the square c8, white replies getting with the king into c4, and again white possesses the opposition. And now after the king gets left, white king is just mirroring the moves of black, having opposition all over again. And now as you can see, after having the opposition, if the opponent is getting onto the same rank, if there are no other obstacles, when you get the opposition, you can reach the opposition after the move of the opponent. And now therefore it would be very important at next examples. Now let's have a look into the next idea, because at this moment we'll see what happens if the king is getting into the other side of the board, or if the king is making the progress. Previously we saw the king getting into the square d8, and now let's see what happens if the king of the weaker side will make the progress. What is going on? Now after the king gets into the square d7, as you can see, white king is getting into the square d5, and again white is having the opposition. Both kings are standing on the same squares, same color squares. Between the kings there is the odd number of squares, and at the same time, as you can see in a moment, white reached the opposition because they make the move as the last one, and no matter where the black king goes, white is going to have the opposition again next move. After going right, white is going right as well, having again the opposition. After going right again, white is getting the mirrored move, having the opposition all over again. And after getting to g7, white is having the opposition, playing the king with g5. And that's why, no matter when the king goes, white is able to reach the opposition all over again. And that's why it was king d8, king d7. Now let's see what happens if the king gets to the square e7. After king e7, again, white is able to have the opposition, and the opposition favors the side of the side who is having this opposition, because the side can get through or penetrate into the opponent's position. Therefore, it is very, very important that in a moment you'll see what happens. Now, black needs to make a move. If black gets into the d7 square, white penetrates the position, getting into the 7th rank. And now, if black would get the opposite way, then white is penetrating the position, getting into the 7th rank, the other side of the board. And therefore, either after any of the moves of black, white is reaching the square c7 or g7, or to be more precise, any of the squares on the 7th rank if white wishes to do so. And that's why at this moment we saw what happens if the king gets into the square d8, if the king gets into the square d7, if the king gets into the square e7, and in a moment we'll see what happens if the king gets into the f8 or f7. Therefore, at this moment, I guess you understand this idea. And one more time, after the king gets e7, white has the opposition. After the king gets left, the king goes right. And if the king goes right, the opposite king goes left. And that's why at this moment, having the opposition is another proof that one of the sides can gain territory, move forward, break through, and penetrate the opponent's camp with the king. Now let's check out what happens if we will be having the opportunity to have the diagonal opposition. Now look at this position. White makes a move and gains the opposition. At this moment, again, as you can see, the kings are standing into the opposition, because if we just make the square, all of the square colors are the same one, therefore it is the odd number of squares with the diagonal. Therefore, it's one of the tricks that you can use. And now, after getting into the square c6, as we previously saw, we have the diagonal opposition. At this moment, it's the diagonal direct opposition due to the least number of squares between the kings. And now, white king is having the opposition, and black king can get into any of these squares onto the last rank, the 8th one, or onto the A file. Therefore, in a moment, you'll see how it works. After the king chooses to get into the last rank, starting with the b8 square, white king gets the opposition. Again, if the king tries to get through the 7th rank, white king says no, access denied, access denied, access denied, access denied. And now, as you can see, with the blue arrow, I highlighted the possible squares by the black king. If the king decides to get back and forth over the last rank, the red arrow shows that the black king cannot reach any squares on the 7th rank. And therefore, at this moment, after the opposition by white, if black king starts getting into the last rank, it cannot escape with the last rank. Now, the same position, but this time, what happens if the black king is getting the other way? Previously, the king was getting into the b8 square, now this time into a7. And again, white is having the direct opposition, this time direct opposition onto the 7th rank, and therefore at this moment black king would be forced to go only onto the A file. And therefore how it works? The same way, but just the rotated version. If you remember, it is absolutely the same, the only difference is that rotation. And now, as you can see, if we have the opportunity to draw the conclusion, you can see that black king can only get either onto the A file, either onto the last rank, and the red arrows highlights the opportunity for white not to allow black's king to get into any of the squares onto the B file or onto the 7th rank. And therefore, restriction is another very important feature of the opposition. Let's get for the next position. At this moment, you can see both kings, and now, as you can see, there are some colors. The colors are very important at this moment because it represents some of the ideas that I explained briefly. And as you can see, at this moment, both kings are in the opposition. Of course, whoever make the move as the last one has the opposition. And now, at this moment, as we can see, the previous position was the following, and white played the move king f4. After king f4, it is white who possesses or has the opposition, and at this moment you can see what are the benefits for that. Now, as you can see, black king can get into any of the squares with the king's box, as we learned in previous videos. Let's check out what happens if the king gets into the e6 square. After white possesses the direct opposition, and at this moment direct diagonal opposition, after any of the moves by black king, white can reach the opposition again. This time after playing the king onto the square e4, having the opposition onto the file. And therefore at this moment we gain the opposition if the king gets to the square e6. What happens if the king gets to the square d5? After that we reach the opposition again, this time having the king into the f5 square, and we are just having the opposition on the 5th rank, and more precisely this is the horizontal opposition, direct horizontal opposition. And again we are just having more squares to choose, and of course if black gets into the diagonal, again white is getting the same way and reaches the opposition. And if the king gets into the red square right here d7, white is getting again the opposition. If black gets into the square c6, white is getting again opposition. And now we just have blue one to check out, the one onto the e7 and c5, and what happens. After e7 we can have the opposition either with the diagonal, or we can get the opposition with the other line as well. Therefore sometimes there could be two possibilities. And now if the king gets into the square c5, we can get the opposition with the diagonal, or if we wish to, we can have the opposition with the king onto the 5th rank, onto the vertical line. Therefore, as you can see, after reaching the direct opposition, especially the diagonal one, if there are no obstacles after the opposition by white, no matter what black king does, white gets another opposition, and it is that much important because this way you can see that white king would be pushing back the black skin, not allowing to penetrate the position. Okay, let's have a look one more stuff. At this moment, what happens after king gets to e4? At this moment, we have very similar example as the previous one. This time we are having a little bit different exploitation, because this time we are just having the kings that are standing on the e file, previously on the diagonal, this time on the e file. And at this moment we have a direct opposition, because there is just one square between the kings, and the kings are standing on the same file. And now, as I just mentioned previously, the side who has already moved, or the side who is not on the move, is just having the opposition. And now, the same, we can see the colors of the squares that are representing all of the types of opposition. If black is getting up, then white is getting up again, having the opposition. If black is going left, white is going left as well, having the opposition. If black is going right, white is making the same idea, mirroring the moves, having the opposition. And now with the diagonal. After the diagonal up, white is making the same movement, the same type of moves, reaching the opposition. And the last one, the right side up by white as well. And all of the time, white is having the opposition. And therefore, as you can see, this is very important feature, that whenever there are no obstacles, if any of the kings has the direct opposition, it can be changed into the other type of opposition, always, no matter what the opponent kings move. And now let's check out what happens if we are just having the position that is a little bit more interesting than the previous ones, because the previous one was rather a little bit of theory, this time a little bit of practice. Now let's have a look what's going on in this position. First of all, we have the fixed pawns. White pawns are fixed by black, and the opposite is true as well. Black pawns are fixed by white as well. And now, as you can see, what about the kings? The kings are standing on the same file, at this time the d file, but is it the opposition? Let's check it out. If the kings are standing on the same rank, file or diagonal, they need to be on the same color of the square. At this moment, they are not. Therefore, what happens if it is white to move? If it is white to move, white gets forward, and at this moment, as you can see, both kings are on the same color of the square. Black is on the move, therefore white has moved as the last one, and whoever moves as the last one has the odd number of squares on the same rank, file or diagonal, has the opposition. Therefore, white played as the last one and they possess the opposition. And at this moment you can say, okay, therefore this position would be winning, right? Not quite. The opposition is not the most important. You must understand and you must remember that opposition is just the tool to make progress with the king. It is the tool to penetrate or infiltrate the opponent's position, or to help the pawns either to promote, either to make a breakthrough, either to make any other stuff related to the key squares of the pawns, but the opposition is not the most important. Opposition is just the tool to realize another goals. And at this position, let's see what are these goals. Now, black gets closer for the white king, getting as close as possible. Now, again, as you can see, the kings are on the opposite color squares, therefore neither of the side has the opposition. But due to previously white having the opposition, if black king is going forward, white can reach the opposition again, getting closer. At this moment we have again the vertical opposition, and now at the same time, as you can see, this is the opposition because there are odd number of squares between the kings, at this moment 3 squares. And of course, whoever make the move as the last one has the opposition. At this moment, white played the move king d3, therefore white has the opposition. And now what happens with black? Black says, okay, I'm going closer and closer, let's see what's going on. After king d6, again, white is getting into the opposition, playing king d4, and this is the direct opposition. And now, as you can see, the king is unable to break through, I mean the white king, unable to break through via the squares highlighted with the red circles, because these squares are covered by the pawns on the b6 and f6. Therefore, the squares c5 and e5 are not accessible for the white's king, because the king cannot get into the squares that are attacked either by the pawns, either by the pieces. And what then? You may say, okay, due to having the opposition, white must be winning, because all of the time we saw that white had the side that had the opposition had the opportunity to make a lot of damage. At this moment, it's not that easy. Why? Because as I just mentioned, opposition is not the most important stuff. And now, what happens? Black plays king c7. And now you can see, okay, they are just giving us the access for the pawn on f6 after the capture. White king gets into the square g7, and there is so-called stairway to heaven, and the pawn advance. Right? Not quite. Why? Because after the king gets into the square d5, look what happens. At this moment, now black is having the opposition, because black and white kings are standing on the same file. At this moment, there is the odd number of squares between them, therefore the direct opposition, and at the same time it is black who possesses or has the opposition because they play as the last one. And therefore, at this moment, it is white that cannot penetrate the position. They cannot get into any squares on the 6th rank because black's king is controlling that. Therefore, white needs to retreat. After retreating to the square c4, now it is black that is trying to get the same way, capture the pawn and trying to run with its own, and therefore now it's white that is forced to defend against the defeat. And therefore, this is the plan for black. Black tries to get into the square e5 and then capture the white pawn and move the pawn up to the line of the promotion. Therefore, at this moment, white needs to stop it. And now white gets into the square d4, and now as you can see, it is now white that is having the opposition. And therefore it is pretty funny, because it looks like that at one moment one side is having the opposition and another moment the other side. But look closely, because there is very important feature at this position. After king d4, if the king gets into the square e7, previously onto the square c7, at this moment e7. Is it winning? Now the plan is pretty much similar. The only difference is that white king is trying to capture the pawn on the b6 and then getting into the square a7 and then promoting the pawn with the stairway to heaven. And now black needs to stop this plan with the simple idea of the opposition. And now, as you can see, this time white king is unable to penetrate the position. Therefore, at this moment, as you can see, white is unable to break through. Therefore, white cannot capture any of the pawns. And now, what happens with this idea, as we just mentioned previously, after the king gets into d5? Now, as I just mentioned previously, black needs to have the opposition. What would happen if the king gets into the c4 square, king d6, king d4 as previously? But what would it be if the white king would get the other way, into e4? It would be the same, it's a little bit mirrored position. Now again, white needs to stop the king to penetrate via the c5 square, having all of the squares covered on the 5th rank, and therefore black needs to retreat. And therefore it's a little bit like cat and mouse play, that both kings needs to protect the key squares to reach the position, to capture the pawns and reach the winning position. And therefore at this moment you can see that yes, opposition is important, but not the most important one. And therefore you need to be aware of this. And the last position, let's check it out. Looks pretty familiar, isn't it? Yes, you are correct. This is absolutely the same position. And now look about this, because it is very important to understand it. This time we'll just analyze this position and find simple plan how to draw this position by black without using the concept of opposition. How is so? I'll just show you. After king d2, of course, white king is having the plan to get into one of the squares to capture any of the pawns standing on the 6th rank. And after that, the pawn would be not fixed and you can put the pawn into the promotion. And therefore, at this moment, what about black? We are having the very important element that we need to learn. After white is reaching the square d5, black must reply with making the move onto the square d7. No matter what kind of squares the black king would be previously, let's say, staying, but it must get into the square d7 where white king is reaching d5. This is one of the elements. What is another one? White can try to penetrate the position the other way, either getting through for the black pawn for the g6 square or h6 square. And take notice, if black allows for that, black is lost. Therefore, this would be another interesting concept, so-called correspondence squares. Now, after d5, the correspondence square is d7. After white king reaches the square h5, in order not to allow to infiltrate the white king even further, black king must stay into any of these squares. Both are good enough, both are actually possible to reach. Either g7, either h7. And that's it. If you understand that only these two possible ways for white are the possibility to win this position, and if you understand the correspondence squares from the square blue up to the square red, from the blue up to one of the red and the other one, you understand this position and you can very easily and effortlessly defend this position. And now what's going on? Let's check it out. After the king gets into the e7, king gets to e3. After king gets to e8, king f4. Now king f7. Why? Because if white king is getting into h5, black king needs to have the opportunity to get into g7 or h7. Very important maneuver. And now, after the king gets the other way, as we can previously mentioned, after the white king reaches the square d5, black king must reply with king d7, otherwise white would be penetrating the position. And that's why king e7. And after king gets to the d5 square, as we just mentioned, the correspondence squares needs to be reached. At this moment, you do not even need to know about the opposition. And now, at this moment, as you understand that the king can get the other way, not just getting e4, but getting g4, let's check out if it works. As I just mentioned previously, after white king reaches the square h5, black king must stay into one of these two squares, either g7, either h7. What's the point of that? Not allowing the white's king to penetrate the position, otherwise the position would be lost for black. And that's why at this moment, black can get either into the square f8 or it could get into the square g8 as well. After getting into the square h5, as we just mentioned, one of the squares needs to be reached by black king. Of course, at this moment, h7 is not available in one move, but g7 is perfectly fine. And now, as you can see, white king cannot penetrate. And that's why having this door closed has the guarantee not to lose that position. Door closed means that the white king is no longer able to penetrate the position, and I call these squares correspondence squares because this way you can just learn a little bit more at the later stages of your chess career. And that's why at this moment you can see that even though opposition is one of the tools that you need to know, but it's not the most important. And now let's make the summary about our discovery. Let's get into the conclusions and summary. What should we know after this lesson? First of all, we need to know that the opposition is all about one king stopping the other king from making progress or one king pushing the other aside. Another stuff, you need to know that opposition is just a tool we use to push the enemy king out of the way. It is never a main goal, but the way to reach the key squares. Therefore, opposition is a tool one king uses to drive the enemy king out of the way. Another idea that you should be aware of is that the opposition can be either horizontal, vertical, or diagonal. At the same time, it is either direct or distant. Next stuff, the opposition is only when there is an odd number of squares between the kings, either 1, 3, or 5 squares. And next stuff related to the opposition is that if the kings are in the vertical or horizontal position, then we need only to check out if both kings are standing on the same color of squares. In case of the diagonal opposition, however, we have two ways to find out if it is the opposition. Either we count the number of squares between the kings to be sure if it is an odd number, or the easiest way that I recommend, simply drawing the square when both kings stand in the corners and checking out if all of the corners are the same color. And the next stuff you need to know is that the direct opposition shows the power of opposition the easiest way, as the king immediately reaches the key squares and forces the opponent's king to leave the promotion square. And one more part of information about the opposition we need to know and we need to understand and remember. The side who has the opposition is the last one that made a move. In majority, it is the king move, but take notice that in fact it can be a pawn move too. Another idea is that the side who has the opposition is never on the move. Why? Because they have already made a move. And the last part of this stuff is that the side who has the opposition has the king on the same line, as I just mentioned, either vertical, horizontal, or diagonal, with the distance of odd number of squares between both kings. And what about reaching opposition? Reaching opposition helps in the following ways. The first one is the king to advance and break into the opponent's territory, to capture the pawns and create a passed pawn. Another idea is to force the opponent's king to open up the gate, we can say breaking the blockade, and to allow to infiltrate into the enemy's camp. Of course, with the use another interesting ideas, some like Zugzwang, triangulation, or outflanking or shouldering. Another idea about reaching opposition, why it helps, is that it helps because of the ability to reach the key squares as the ultimate goal that makes the previous goals possible to realize. And the last one, a little bit more technical one, is to control the promotion square and build the stairway to heaven. And stairway to heaven are the 3 squares on the file to advance and promote the pawn safely. And the last part about the opposition is the most important from my standpoint. I would like you to know, be aware, and to understand that the opposition is not the most important, because it is not the opposition itself, but the key squares that are the most important at this type of position. Regardless of the opposition, if the stronger side, the one with the pawn, reaches any key squares, then the position is winning. However, when the defending side can and should use the opposition in order not to allow the opponent's king to reach any of these key squares, then the position is drawn, of course with correct play. And now I guess you see why the opposition was introduced a way later than the previous stuff, because I didn't want you to get a little bit confused about this one, and now I guess you can understand it a way easier and a way better. And therefore, that's why I did it at the next episode, not at the first one. And now let's make a little bit of summary. We have just learned about the opposition. As I just mentioned, there are a lot of stuff that you should know, but the most important is to make practice. The more practice, the easier it is to understand it and apply it in practice when you are just playing against other players. And that's why I guess you enjoyed that. I guess you'll understand the main points, and I hope you have a great time learning about this and testing this out in practice. Therefore, thank you very much for watching and see you next time.